like to welcome you here today with us. We are from Montreal talking to you at RISE World Summit 2024. I would like to start by what we usually do here in Montreal with the land acknowledgement. We are based at Concordia University in Montreal, and we are located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which Amr and I are gathered today. Tiohtià:ke, or Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for the many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. Again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Micheline Ayoub. I am the Executive Director of Sustainability in the Digital Age and the Director of the Canada Hub of Future Earth, which is an international network of researchers working on sustainability, of course. I would like to now ask my colleague here, Amr Addas, to introduce himself and tell us a few words about his work. Amr?
Thank you, Micheline. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, this afternoon, tonight, to talk about sustainability and sustainable finance in particular. My role at Concordia University is Professor of Finance. My area of expertise and focus is sustainable finance. I teach courses on sustainable investing. I'm director of a sustainability center at the John Molson School of Business, the business school here at Concordia University. And in the context of these activities, we support work on public policy related to climate finance and climate policies, adaptation, mitigation. We also create content for executive education on sustainability. We're in the process of rolling out a number of micro certificates on different topics related to sustainability, for example, carbon markets, biodiversity and natural capital, water markets and access, communications related to sustainability, and also transition finance. And we've been offering a certification on sustainable investing for the last about 15 years now, started by Professor Paul Srivastava, who was originally from India and was director of research center at Concordia as well. So thank you, and it's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, Amr. I'm going to introduce our own organization where I work, and I have a few slides to share with you. So start screen share. I hope this will work. Yeah, here it is. I guess you can see it now, and I'm presenting. So good morning or good afternoon and good evening again. So my name is Micheline, as I said, and I represent sustainability in the digital age and Future Earth. Who are we? Sustainability in the digital age and Future Earth. Future Earth is a network of networks of researchers that was started in 2015 and that was headed by the same Paul Srivastava that Amr just mentioned. And there are now 9 hubs all over the world working on the same topics of sustainability. And we use the world and the globe as a system, and we do transdisciplinary research. We here in the Canada Hub, we also have thought of all the sustainable development goals for a while. And at some point we thought, what if there is an 18th one that is about digital technologies? So digital technologies would be serving the people and the planet. So in around 2018, we started gathering and discussing with colleagues around us about what can digital technologies do for sustainability. And hence, the Sustainability in the Digital Age initiative started, that is working at the nexus of knowledge systems and digital innovation and at the intersection of science and policy making as well. And we always think of sustainability and how it can be served by digital tools, as well as we look at policy, research, and training work. And as well, we look at what are the risks of using the digital tools in terms of environmental, social, and governance. As for environmental, it could be the energy use, the e-waste, the electronic waste, and the raw materials used for sustainability for digital tools. For the social, it would be about the digital divide, the workforce disruption or misinformation that could be used by the digital tools. And for governance, it could be about unconscious bias, data privacy and security, and surveillance that could be brought upon us by some digital tools. So this is in short what we do. And I would like to now ask Amr, I think I stopped sharing. Yes. I would like to ask Amr to tell us a little bit more of what he thinks, what ESG is meant, so we can explore that theme with you here at RISE World Summit, Think Different, Act Together. So Amr, I did mention very quickly what ESG are. However, we hear a lot about them. We hear a lot about a framework to report on them. Can you just introduce the topic for us, please?
Sure. So ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance factors, mostly through the business lens. And this is a term that, of course, has been around for a number of years and has been at the center of a lot of corporate strategies in different organizations around the world. It means different things to different people. But for the most part, the way we would define ESG is environmental factors, social factors, governance-related, corporate governance-related factors that would have a material impact on the business, right? So something that would affect the company's operations in a material way. Material, quote unquote, means significant, something that would move the needle in some form. And of course, among those ESG factors, one stands out very clearly, and that is climate, right? Climate change, and it reverberates across the three, actually, right? So climate governance is an important component of how we would assess corporations and how they're governed. The spillover of climate change on the social side is also something that we're increasingly seeing in the form of involuntary migration, impact on the cost of living. Lots of studies that have come out showing that a not insignificant portion of the rise in the cost of living, especially food, is driven directly and can be linked directly to climate change. So from a corporate perspective, climate dominates really among the E, and therefore the E in ESG tends to dominate as well. So of course, that's something that is a challenge for businesses and companies to grapple with, to pin down and measure. How do you measure your exposure? How do you understand the risk that climate change might pose to you as a business? And so what we look at is breaking it down into the physical risk of climate change and the transition risk of climate change. And physical, of course, means the acute, right? The things that we see on the news, the unfortunate types of weather events, wildfires in Canada last year, which were record levels, extreme heat in Europe. Right now in some parts of Western Canada, it's the opposite, extreme cold as a result of the weakening of the Gulf Stream, which creates a so-called polar vortex. Essentially, Arctic air comes down much further south and for a longer period of time than it usually would. So these are the extreme or acute impacts we see. Monsoon season in India, of course, is another major potential weather system that is affected by climate. But then you have also the chronic, right? That's the slowly rising sea levels, the slowly rising temperature, and these are the things that have less of a visible, newsworthy impact, but are no less damaging and potentially even more so, right? At some point, sea levels will rise enough to spill over, right? To start inundating and flooding coastal land. Already in the state of California in the United States, two major insurers announced that they would no longer insure residential property going forward because of the risk of climate change. So this kind of raises the challenge of, okay, what are we doing about it, right? And that's the transition risk. And of course, transition risk is more immediate. for businesses, because that has to do with pricing, carbon pricing. For example, Canada has a carbon price. European Union has a carbon price. Many jurisdictions around the world now have carbon prices as well. The range of the price varies quite significantly. It's certainly not at the level where it would yet move the needle in many parts of the world in terms of changing behavior. But the presence of carbon pricing is a form of regulatory risk and transition-related risk. You mentioned reporting, Micheline, so that kind of gets to the heart of the matter, which is for corporations to understand their exposure to these issues, to climate change, and to report on exposure. They need a standardized set of disclosure rules, right? And this is the good news, in a way, is that we have arrived at a moment where this standard now exists through the IFRS Foundation, which set up the ISSB, International Sustainability Standards Board. This was set up in Glasgow at the COP26 in Glasgow over 2 years ago, in November 2021. It was formalized. And what it did is it consolidated a set of existing disclosure standards, SASB, TCFD, and others, into one standard, right, or one organization. And that organization, ISSB, has its co-headquarters, the North American headquarters, actually right here in Montreal, and its global headquarters in Frankfurt in Germany. And what they've done is last July, they released the first two standards, IFRS S1 and IFRS S2. S1 relates to corporate disclosure standards for all sustainability-related matters, except climate. That is in S2, right? So S2 is, IFRS S2 is the climate disclosure standards that companies are expected to use in order to report on their exposure to climate change. Now, this will, of course, depend on what kind of sector you're in, right? So there's a materiality process to assess materiality. If you're in the oil and gas sector, the types of risks that you face are very different than if you're in the communication sector, let's say, or consumer discretionary or retail. So that's what the disclosure standards help you assess, which is how am I exposed, and what do I have to report on, what do I have to measure. Carbon emissions, of course, are a major or starting point, at least, to measure climate change. And you'll notice that I kept using the word, how are you exposed? How is the business exposed? This is another kind of contentious issue because there's also a push to understand the other way around, right? Which is, how are you as a business affecting climate or the environment, right? This is the so-called double materiality argument and discussion. So in the European Union, you have disclosure requirements already on the books, and increasingly more will be coming into force for both investors and corporate entities to report on their in both directions, right? So how are they exposed to climate risks and opportunities, and what is their own impact on the planet, on the environment, through their operations, right? So this is already, like I said, a requirement in the EU. As the ISSB was developing its standards, there was a lot of pressure from stakeholders, especially NGOs, for ISSB to move in that direction as well, to create standards for double materiality reporting. But they made it clear this is not their mandate, right? Their mandate is to create a set of disclosure standards for users of financial statements. For capital markets users, essentially, right? And that's what they've stuck to. The distinction between one-way materiality and double materiality is not as large as might appear. For example, if you report, let's say, on scope 3 emissions, which are the emissions through your value chain, supply chain, customers, and so on, in a way, you are reporting your impact as a business on the environment, right? So that would fall into both categories. So some people feel very strongly about it. I'm not sure it's such a major obstacle. The fact that we already have a lot of standards in place, and the reporting on those will begin next year, as of 2024, data from 2024. So actually started 3 weeks ago, January 1st, officially came into force, the ISSB standard. So a lot of investors and people in the corporate world are looking to see how this will develop. Of course, the reality is it's also reporting on these issues requires resources. Companies and corporate entities feel like there's a lot of expectation and demand on their resources to create these reports. And the fact that there is consolidation should hopefully reduce the amount of reporting redundancy, let's say, in the reporting process that they might have to do.
Thanks, you, Amr. Thank you for this exhaustive introduction to the topic. I have a question for you on that. You mentioned the S1, the S2, the standards. However, if we dig deeper into each one or both, we sort of notice that there may be a lack of standardized metrics. I believe I'm not necessarily the expert as you are in those topics, but I believe if we go into the details, there may not be standardized metrics for the reporting frameworks on those ESGs. And that may make it very challenging for investors, companies, stakeholders who are working on these topics. How do you think we can overcome this barrier to move forward to a more, I would say, transparent disclosure? We at Sustainability in the Digital Age and Future Earth, we are very much in contact, I would say, with topics on biodiversity almost every day. And how would companies deal with such a thing, for instance, if they don't have the data, they don't have access to it, or they don't know what it means?
Yeah, so biodiversity, of course, is natural capital. It's a whole different ball game. Biodiversity is certainly a key component in the whole climate change story in terms of the fact that the climate is changing has a serious impact on biodiversity and natural capital, and unfortunately, extinction of species and so on, which is the footprint that we have as a species on this planet is quite detrimental to other species, unfortunately. And it is complex for sure, right? So, maybe I'll step back just a second, then talk more about biodiversity. But in terms of standardization of reporting for climate, of course, we have scope 1, 2, and 3, right? That's sort of the starting point, which is scope 1 is direct emissions associated with the business. These are usually fairly straightforward and not too difficult to assess, right? There are, existing body of science that allows companies to measure and assess the different types of, industrial operations, et cetera. That's not too hard. Scope 2 is a special category that's essentially any emissions associated with the utilities that you use, your heating, your cooling, your electricity. How is that generated? And that also is quite standardized. The challenge then comes for scope 3, right? So when you have oil and gas companies that make commitments to be carbon neutral or net zero on their operations and heating and utilities, scope 1 and 2, that's not so hard to pull off. Obviously they have to invest in carbon capture and storage and so on. But that only represents 12 to 15% of emissions associated with their products, with their operations, right? Because 85% or more comes from the combustion of the fuels, of the fossil fuels, right? The burning of gasoline in a vehicle, for example. So that is the challenge. For banks, it's a similar story, right? It's financed emissions. The bulk of a bank's emissions come from where the money goes, the capital that they allocate, right? Not their ultra modern skyscrapers, which are super efficient already in terms of electricity use, and so that complicates things, because as you start to look at measuring scope 3, it's not your own emissions, right? It's someone else's emissions in your supply chain or your value chain, downstream as well. And a lot of these, if you start to go into multiple levels, right? So tier 2, tier 3, even tier 4 suppliers. A lot of these end up, they're small mom and pop shops or small operations that simply don't have the capacity to measure their emissions. And that creates a problem, because, you can pressure your primary suppliers to provide you data, but they have to then go get that data from their own suppliers. And at the end of the day, you're going to reach a level, small and medium enterprises that just don't have the resources or the skills or know-how to come up with credible data, right? So yeah, that's definitely a challenge yet to be solved. It's work in progress. We are making progress towards developing standardized data in that space. And there are, of course, lots of resources and tools available. And of course, there's always also the kind of bootstrapping in a way where you can assess the operation, and knowing what kind of operation your supplier is engaged in, you can make a fairly reasonable estimate of what the emissions are. The risk then comes with things like double counting, right? So if you look at, for example, the emissions associated with someone taking a flight from Montreal to Mumbai, let's say, right? So the emissions would count as scope 1 for the airline, right? That's direct operations. It would be scope 3 for the airport, right, from which they took off and landed. The company that produced the gasoline, right, the airline, the jet fuel that powered the plane, whoever it is, that's also scope 3. The manufacturer of the airplane, right, Boeing or Airbus or what have you, that's also a form of emission for them. Right, so you can imagine that it gets quite complicated, right? For the business that sent, let's say that Concordia sends me on this flight, right? Then that counts also as scope 3 for Concordia. So the challenge here is, how do you avoid the double, triple, quadruple, quintuple counting that could come from looking at aggregate emissions in this form? And so that's also something that obviously people are aware of, and developing ways to mitigate and avoid this kind of double counting. And this, of course, pertains more to anyone who's looking at, let's say, at a portfolio emissions, right? So if I'm a pension fund or an asset manager looking to owning, let's say, the stocks of some of these companies, and let's say I own, the airport is publicly listed, and I own the shares of that airport, and I own the airline, and I own the oil and gas company, right? So if I want to measure my portfolio emissions, I need to be aware of how there's interaction between those companies that I own in my portfolio, and to avoid the double counting, so I don't end up over-reporting my emissions. And so that's something that, of course, a lot of resources exist to try to work on. But again, large investors have an army of teams that can develop these resources, whereas smaller ones struggle to come up with accurate data. Now, back to the biodiversity and natural capital. So that's an interesting area to keep an eye on in terms of where things are going. So last year, well, not last year now, it's December 2022, there was a COP15 conference here in Montreal. Most people, when we talk about COP, they think of the climate COP, the UN climate meetings that happen every year, and one just wrapped up in Dubai. The biodiversity COPs are less well known, but the one that took place in Montreal, the COP15, reached an agreement, an unprecedented agreement, with involvement from the financial industry for the first time, and it's called the Kunming-Montreal Protocol on Biodiversity, and of course that has some very important ambitions to reduce, reverse deforestation, protect natural capital, and try to mitigate the impact that we have and our human activities have on nature and biodiversity. The challenge and measurement there, of course, is a whole different ballgame, right? It's with climate as complex as it is, that you need to measure emissions, scope 1, 2, and 3. That's for the most part, your main metric to assess your exposure to climate change. We would typically normalize it, divide by revenue or assets or what have you, in order to compare between different companies. And exposure to transition risk and so on, all these things can be assessed in the context of, let's say, carbon price. You can quantify that. With nature, it's much more complex, right? The different attempts to measure things like, the species, number of species within a square meter, let's say, of land, right? The average per square meter, or other metrics that are far more complicated and are harder to measure. So on that front, there's also some good news, which is the TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which last year released also a set of guidelines and disclosures. And Now there are over 300 companies globally that have announced their adoption of the TNFD standards and their intention to report on their impact on nature. So in that sense, as complicated as it is to look at reporting related to nature and biodiversity, there is this effort that is gathering momentum and is gaining a lot of support. And I think there's increasing awareness among investors and companies in general that once you get into the process of really understanding your exposure to climate change, you will quickly realize that your exposure and impact on nature and biodiversity is closely related, and that climate change itself is manifesting itself through the natural cycle and natural capital, and that you can't separate the two, right? So ultimately, in a way, once you've committed to providing disclosure on climate, most companies will come around to realizing that they have no choice but to go further and also put some resources and effort into understanding their impact on biodiversity and natural capital.
Thank you, Amr. I'm listening to you. I'm thinking it's like of going to take your courses at the university. I have actually a question. You mentioned in the answer you gave me, you mentioned the pop and mom shop, and then you mentioned the TNFD guidelines. I have two parts to my questions. Like you also said we could estimate, or companies or somebody specialist would estimate. Would there be a method that would be used to estimate, to avoid overestimation or underestimation of the mom and pop shops effect? And how would we estimate the mom and pop shops effect on biodiversity? How would they deal with it? Would there be also a way to do that? I think the emissions may be a much more easy problem to deal with than biodiversity, especially when we talk about the smaller businesses. I like the word that you use, mom and pop shop, because I relate to that. So
Yeah.
what do you think we could do, or the world can do? Because it's not just in Canada; it would be all over the world.
Yeah, for sure. That is challenging, and you're right. It's all over the world. It's not just in developed economies. And when we look at how integrated supply chains are and continue to be, regardless of all the talk about anti-globalization and so on, the reality is that's all marginal, right? The world is integrated and globalized, and it's highly unlikely that this would reverse itself in any meaningful way. It's difficult, honestly, to answer that question. For small enterprises, mom and pop shops, the emissions part is not onerous in the sense that it's not an unsolvable problem. If you're producing a certain product that you're specialized in, and that product follows a certain manufacturing process that is fairly well established and known, it's not hard for scientists and engineers to come up with an assessment of the emissions that would be associated with the production of such a product, right? Especially when countries have certain energy mix, how their operations are powered is known, right? If you're in Canada and Quebec, there's a lot of hydro, right? In different parts of the world, you have other forms of electricity generation, and that tends to be a big chunk of the emissions. So yeah, and the emission side, it is feasible to estimate emissions associated with such small operations. On the biodiversity and natural capital, it's honestly too early to come up with a credible answer, because it's early days already for large organizations, right? TNFD just came up with the standards. TNFD itself, of course, has been around for a number of years since TCFD was launched, the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosures, a couple of years after TNFD came around. So large corporations are just starting to grapple with their own reporting and exposure to natural capital and biodiversity. Today, if I'm a small company or family owned, shop, I would not simply I would simply not have the resources to go there at all. Maybe one role that organizations, governments can play, or multilateral organizations, or even philanthropic organizations that have an interest in mitigating climate change and biodiversity loss. One role they could play is to help out, right? To get involved and see how they can potentially support such small operators whose objective is to to make a living, right? And if you put too much pressure on them and um, set expectations that are just unrealistic and can really tie their hands, then you will not get the data, and if you get it, it's not going to be reliable, right? So I think when it comes to this, if we really want to understand the interaction between the operations of small companies or small family-owned businesses like this, then there will need to be support from governments or multilateral organizations or philanthropic organizations, or all.
So you mentioned support. Do you mean financial support, or do you mean support with access to data or gathering the data for them? Even us at Sustainability in the Digital Age, we do deal with data on biodiversity. However, we deal with this data on a research project. And let's say if you are a mom and pop shop and you come to us and say, how about you give me this data? We won't be able to give it to you. So do you think the government should be either gathering such data and putting it out there for mom and pop shops, or put a framework on data sharing, if I can call it this way, in terms of biodiversity data? I know that I'm not very familiar with the TNFD guidelines in details, but probably there will be some necessity of certain types of data on certain types of living organisms, perhaps. Let's say trees. How are we affecting trees or certain species of trees? What do you think in practice could or should be done?
So financial support from governments is probably a non-starter, because most governments, especially post-pandemic, are not in great fiscal shape, let's say, to put it mildly. So I don't expect that this. I think this would be a non-starter for most governments. They don't have the resources or really the infrastructure to to provide direct support. But what they could perhaps provide is some framework or expectations for how companies can assess their exposure. Financial support and standardization or help navigating the reporting framework that TNFD has released. That could come more from organizations like nonprofits. There are a lot of philanthropic organizations out there, like from wealthy individuals that have a mandate to tackle these issues, and especially in developing countries, right? So I don't see those organizations being leveraged enough and being utilized and involved in this conversation enough, because I think ultimately we need to have this data from smaller operators, and they just simply can't provide it on their own. So I think involvement, some kind of partnership between governments, corporations, and philanthropic organizations would help. Corporations meaning the ultimate clients, right? The customers of those smaller shops. They have a responsibility to report on their own supply chain, and so they have to find ways to get credible data. And and those types of things already exist, right? A lot of those big companies, they support their suppliers. They create programs to help them report. They get directly involved in many cases in gathering the data and putting it together. I think that the issue is it doesn't extend far enough down that supply chain to the third and fourth level suppliers. But if we want to have credible standardized data, then we need to go that far. So it's really kind of an all of the above type of partnership that I think is needed.
So you're giving me more work to do in my own little institution, because this is what we do. Well, our speciality is partly putting people together to discuss these issues and perhaps to go forward. I have another question for you still. Um, so, so it is a growing trend. It's not going away. It is a growing trend, and everybody should be or would be abiding on and following it. How do you think we could ensure the effective engagement of stakeholders, including the employees of those stakeholders or within communities, customers, everybody around those issues in order to build and maintain the trust in the system and in the work that is being done? You know, we in our little organization, we see a lot of mistrust sometimes, and it's very hard to overcome. On our own little level, we try as much as we can on a personal level to replenish those linkages. But on such a big scale, which is basically worldwide, in the system, in the reporting, in where we should go. What do you think of that?
I think that's really a very timely question, and it's a critical time to ask those types of questions, right? Because we're entering now a phase, or we have been, and it's getting worse. A period where discussion and debate of complex issues is becoming harder, where the social media conversation is becoming more superficial, more adversarial, more aggressive. Those that are loudest and most provocative tend to get the most attention. And so effective engagement is quite challenging today, right? And we're entering, this is a year of a record number of people around the world voting in countries, across the globe. And there's a lot of concern that some of those elections will result in outcomes that are ultimately detrimental to the planet and to our collective effort to deal with climate change. And there's a serious concern that we can't have conversations anymore, right? That the world is so polarized and tribal, and that these issues are simply disparaged, ignored, ridiculed. So it's very unfortunate, because things like climate change are complex, right? This is not a conversation that you can have at a superficial level. It's a complex issue, and its implications affect. It's something that requires a whole of economy approach, really, right? With collaboration between government, between businesses, between investors, individuals that have to examine their own habits and how they go about their lives. So I can give you an example from our own organization, where we have the president of Concordia, Graham Carr, has been an exemplary leader when it comes to how Concordia has tackled its own exposure to sustainability issues by engaging across the university, the faculty members, the staff, the students, with different conversations to involve everyone in developing a comprehensive climate action plan and sustainability plan across the campus. So we have now plan and targets that are publicly announced to embed sustainability across all the operations of Concordia, from an operations and buildings perspective, from research perspective, pedagogy, so content, and policies in general, and investments, right? So Concordia has been one of the leading organizations when it comes to making sustainable investment commitments, and I mean globally, not just in Canada. So the success there came from conversation and engagement and calm discussions. I'm obviously somebody who is very visibly involved with sustainability and with sustainable investing, having taught a course there for over 10 years now and been involved in different forms for a long time. And yet sometimes I have conversations with students that perceive me to be a radical capitalist because I don't think that because I don't support some of the policies that they demand in terms of end fossil fuels tomorrow, divest from every single oil and gas company. So I think the solution to that is to have conversations, and so we hold town halls with the students. We have discussions with the students, and I think the key is for people to feel heard and to create an environment where people can express their opinion, and to lower the conversation, lower the temperature and tone, right? So everyone can express themselves without judgment, without labeling. And I know it's easier said than done, right? But it's something that it takes hard work, and it's every day, right? And like I said, the example we have at Concordia shows that this can lead to results. When it comes to trying to sort of aggregate this at a more national level and a global level, I think one of the most important things that we have to do is to engage the developing world, and this is starting to happen, right? But someone at a conference here in Montreal last year said something that I think resonated and is really important, which is climate change is not going to be solved in Montreal or New York or London. It's going to be solved in Kuala Lumpur and Mumbai and Johannesburg, right? Because unless you can bring in the developing world and acknowledge and recognize their own concerns and their own right and entitlement to economic growth like the West has developed, there has to be first financial compensation for emissions that have been put in the atmosphere so far cumulatively by the United States more than any other country. European Union is not far behind if you look at emissions over the last 200 years. Yes, China emits more than any other country today, and India's emissions are rising rapidly. But per capita emissions in China is about a third of Canada and the US, and in India it's about 1/8 or 1/9. So there's you and I, Micheline, have a much bigger impact on this planet than anybody living in India or China. So I think that conversation has to happen. The loss and damage component of climate was agreed to last year in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt and at the COP27. Some funds have been committed already this year after COP28. A lot more needs to be committed. Small island states in the Pacific that are simply asking to continue to exist. They need support. So I think at the global level, leadership means that a serious conversation has to happen. Agreements have to take place. Enough capital has to be transferred, not as handouts or giveaways, but as investments and loans and different forms of support to developing countries. Because at the end of the day, developing countries are better off developing using tomorrow's technology, right? Instead of building an infrastructure that will ultimately not be sustainable. It's much more efficient for them to build a sustainable infrastructure. But they need capital, they need expertise, know-how, engineering skills, project management skills. And that's another reason why, for example, oil and gas companies should not be shunned, in my opinion, and sort of excluded because and point the finger as they're the source of the problem. Well, yes, fossil fuels are the biggest source of emissions globally, but those companies also have project management expertise and engineering skills at scale that nobody else possesses. And those skills are very transferable to large-scale renewable projects, hydrogen, offshore wind, and so bringing those types of companies and institutions into the conversation and looking at them as part of the solution rather than part of the problem, I think is key as well, right? So it's really about recognizing that we face this challenge as a planet, and as the French president said, there is no planet B, and we have no choice. We're stuck, right? We're stuck with each other and with this planet.
Yeah. Well, thank you for bringing that point of view, which I would say can be controversial in certain, at least in your classroom. Probably it is. I want to, listening to you and listening to all the difficulties perhaps that we may be facing in doing this, like you just said, there is no planet B and there is no plan B. Um, what do you think is next?
I think the answer to that question will ultimately depend on politics. Unfortunately, as you know, climate change has been politicized in this part of the world, in North America, not so much in other parts of the world. It's viewed more agnostically from a political standpoint in Europe and Asia. So, to a large extent, it will depend on the outcome of elections in the United States in particular, right? There's the Inflation Reduction Act, which the current American administration passed, and that has unleashed hundreds of billions of dollars worth of investment in transition-related investments in the United States. If you look at dollar figures invested in quote unquote transition, record number last year, $1.8 trillion globally, far exceeding investments in fossil fuels for the first time in history, after equaling those at 1.2 trillion each in 2022. Ironically, the vast majority of those investments are in so-called red states or Republican dominated states in the U.S. If the administration changes and the former president comes back to the White House, he has been very vocal about his intentions to gut the Inflation Reduction Act and do his best to reverse it. Whether he succeeds or not, should he become president, is an open question, because it's likely that he would face resistance from those Republican states that are benefiting from those types of investments, and of course from businesses that have made it clear that their competitive future lies in a lower carbon economy. So that's an open question, and obviously the outcome of that will help us. Will give us some clarity on what's ahead. I think the more complex answer, I guess, is businesses have clearly recognized the risks posed by sustainability issues, and not just climate change, but inequality, right, which leads to frustration and desperation, and people leaving their homes and having to migrate and put themselves through hardship. And so businesses realize the challenges, investors realize the challenges, politicians in many parts of the world realize the challenges, but the actions and the commitments we have so far are not enough, right? So we see all kinds of net zero commitments by governments and companies. If you track the alignment of those commitments with facts on the ground, we have a lot of commitments, but we have no evidence to show that we've peaked emissions yet, right? We need to reduce emissions by 50% by the end of this decade if we have any chance of being on track for net zero by 2050. So what's next? One of the possible scenarios could be that as we continue to sort of trudge along and move in fits and starts towards decarbonization without sufficient progress, making one step forward, two steps back. At some point, you might get a moment of panic, right? You might get this kind of collective panic if perhaps some very unfortunate climate event happens somewhere that really resonates, and you get this collective mentality of, we need to do something more drastic. That might be a plausible outcome at some point this decade. And this would not be ideal from an economic standpoint, because it would be quite disruptive. And of course, the longer we wait, the higher the cost of doing something about climate change. But that could be a way to sort of shock the system and move us forward. The positive, more optimistic scenario is that we just continue to incrementally ramp up ambitions and slowly reduce the trajectory from now we're on track for like 2.5, 2.8 degree warming, as we raise ambition and slowly sort of nudge that incrementally down towards somewhere between, somewhere below 2, because 1.5 at this point is perhaps out of reach, most likely. So those are scenarios. What will actually happen? I mean, if anybody could tell you what will happen with certainty, I'd love to speak to them, because they would probably have an opportunity to capitalize on that certainty in a significant way.
Yeah, they would make money looking into the crystal ball, probably. So
Exactly.
you just said shock the system. I don't know, would that be, it sounds scary to me, shocking a system, at least from my own point of view. How do you think that would work? Where would it leave us? It happens, let's say, if it happened in a few years, where would we be from then?
Shock to the system, the most direct way, ask any credible economist, he'll tell you a global price on carbon, right? So you price carbon, a ton of emissions at $100 or $120 a ton on every economic activity, every sector, right? As we know, we have a carbon price in Canada, but some sectors aren't affected at all, right? They're not all subject to carbon pricing. So a shock to the system would be such a carbon price globally. Of course, it's naive to think that this is going to happen. It's not plausible at this point, not even within the realm of possibilities. But again, this is such an unprecedented challenge that we don't know if what kind of response we might be looking at. But that would be an example. Of course, this would impact a lot of developing countries. It wouldn't happen on its own in a vacuum. There would have to be a bigger understanding where, okay, we're going to impose this global price on carbon, but with some support and subsidies and financial incentives for countries that would be negatively affected. And it's not so far-fetched to think that this is something that would happen in an indirect way. For example, the European Union has already passed its carbon border adjustment mechanism law, right? So now it's passed the EU Parliament and the Commission, and it's in the process of being ratified by EU governments. And this law, when it comes into effect in a couple of years, will essentially impose a carbon tax at the border, right? So if you're importing products into the European Union from a jurisdiction that does not have a price on carbon, or that has a price on carbon emissions that is low, the importer will be obliged to pay the difference between the price in the European Union and the price in that exporting country. So in a way, that's an indirect form of imposing a global carbon tax. Canada government has previously expressed its interest in such a plan as well, as have the Americans, even though they don't technically have a carbon price, but that's a conversation for another time. But they're open to that as well. So that could be one form in which this kind of happens by stealth, if you will. But yeah, to be determined. We'll see how that ends up playing out.
So my last question to you, we still have a few more minutes. Do you think we're going to succeed in tackling all this? All those issues,
I think,
there are so many different variables in it. Like you have the emissions, you have the biodiversity, you have the big companies, you have the small companies, you have various different countries. You mentioned the EU; they are sort of working like one country, or at least they do have one. They try to normalize a system among those countries. However, there are other countries. You mentioned the countries that are a little bit less fortunate than others. There are a lot of moving pieces there. Do you think we're going to be able to succeed at some point?
If I didn't think we had a chance, I wouldn't be in this business. And I think you would probably agree as well, right? You wouldn't be doing what you're doing if you didn't think we had a chance either. I think it's probably the biggest challenge that we've faced as a species, humans have a way of coming together when faced with adversity, and certainly human ingenuity is not something to be undermined, right? So creativity and science and engineering solutions can really do wonders. Some of the technology that we're seeing already, direct air capture, carbon removal, all kinds of innovations in the agricultural space, and the kinds of organisms that can that are super absorbers of carbon. There are all kinds of innovations that are taking place. Some talk about geoengineering and seeding the clouds to reflect sunlight and so on. It's another level. But yeah, I think it's a tall order. It's a massive challenge. But I think we have the tools to solve it. What we, for the moment, lack is the political will and courage at a global level. But stay optimistic, and we may get there.
Well, thank you, Amr, for that very insightful conversation. What I take from it is it's a topic I like, is basically we need to all work together. You mentioned partnering between governments, companies, communities, etc. For me, that's inherent to the work we do every day at Future Earth and sustainability in the digital age. And it's also I would say a personal philosophy of mine is I cannot do everything alone. So I always need to work with other people and learn from other people. And I've learned a lot from you today, actually. Like I said, perhaps I'll go take your lectures every day. You'll see me in your class.
It would be a pleasure.
Same here. I had kept a few minutes for perhaps questions from the audience, but I was looking. If you saw me distracted, I was looking at the chat. There is none, which means the discussion was very, very pleasant and very clear. So people did not have any questions to ask about that. So thank you very much, Amr. Thank you for the Rise World Summit 2024 to allow us to be here, to have invited us to be here to have this discussion with you today on the ESGs and also on sustainability in basically we tackled the world, not just Canada. And thank you for the organizers of the World Summit to help us, with the platform and with the chatting system, etc. Because it was new to me to use the platform. Yeah. So if there are no more questions, I don't see any. I wish you, Amr, a very good day. Whoever is listening in the afternoon, a very good afternoon. And whoever is listening and it's evening, a very good and pleasant evening for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Micheline. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.